We got another one of them. Popping at the mouth or the side of his neck when he pouts. No argument, no rebuttal from. He ain't from my town, I don't know him, so I'm guessing he's a clown.
Welcome to the 3-Count Library. Today, we're going to be looking at Brody, The Triumph and Tragedy of Wrestling's Rebel by Larry Matysik and Barbara Goodish. This book is a biography on Bruiser Brody, who was murdered in 1988 by Jose Gonzalez in Bayamon, Puerto Rico. So for a lot of younger fans, he's one of these pre-WrestleMania sort of superstars who died, who never really got the respect that he deserved. So you kind of have to get, but the reason why I am doing this video for people who are like, okay, why should I listen to this? I don't care about Bruiser Brody. It's because there are parts of this book, because Matysik is a former promoter in St. Louis, that discusses Vince McMahon and his expansion into St. Louis. So you get a real deep understanding of what took place in St. Louis from a guy who was there. And at the same time, we also get to talk about one of the most charismatic, excellent pro wrestlers ever in Bruiser Brody. And we also going to talk about his murder. So as usual, we're going to pick 3 subjects out of the entire book. The 3 subjects are going to be obviously his murder, which is going to be discussed. We're also going to talk about his life and career. And that might be the best we could do. So the book is alternating chapters where Matysik tells, the history of Bruiser Brody through extensive interviews with his friends like Stan Hansen. And we also get to, Barbara Goodish gives us the other side of Bruiser Brody, sort of how he was at home. So she also gives us like the stories of like how they met, how they got married, their son Jeff, all that kind of stuff. To me, I'm more interested in the wrestling part and not so much as the man Bruiser Brody, as much as I am. Because you get parts of the man from Matysik. You get to see what kind of person he was through the interviews that Matysik performed for the book. Now, I actually did a favor and watched this. I watched a documentary that was also accompanied this. I'm not going to bring that too much of that in. Because, if I want you to read the book or to know what's in the book, I have to focus on the book. But the documentary is highly focused on the book. But there are some things that are in the documentary that are not really in the book that might need to be clarified. So we actually start the book with the murder of Bruiser Brody. But for the purpose of this, I'm going to tell it straight from the beginning, from his life story, and we're going to end with the murder. So let's begin with the life story of Bruiser Brody. Bruiser Brody was born Frank Goodish on June 18th, 1946 in Pennsylvania. Shortly after his birth, his family moved to Warren, Michigan, which is, right where Eminem is from. So if you're a younger wrestling fan, you may say, oh, I've heard of Warren. Yeah, that's right outside of Detroit. So he always wanted to play football, and he was a football player. He played semi-pro football in 1969 for the San Antonio Toros. Had a tryout for the Washington Redskins in 1970. Interesting enough, I skipped over it, but he actually went to my old alma mater. He went to Wayne State University for a little while. I graduated from Wayne State University, so that's pretty cool. He was introduced to wrestling by Ivan Putski, who brought him to Fritz Von Erich, who was the owner, promoter of World Class Championship Wrestling in Dallas. And he also introduced him to Joe Blanchard, who was the owner and promoter of Southwest Championship Wrestling out of San Antonio. There in Dallas, he was trained by Bob Roop and Bob Orton Sr. He made his wrestling debut in 1974. After a few months, he was sent to Tri-State Wrestling, which was owned and promoted by Leroy McGurk and Bill Watts. In Tri-State, he teamed up with Stan Hansen. This was 1974. Stan Hansen and Bruiser Brody went to the same college, West Texas State University. West Texas State University is a pretty famous wrestling university. There's tons of wrestlers that went to that university. The Funks, I believe Dusty went to that school. I think maybe even Ted DiBiase might have gone to that school. There's a lot of guys who went to West Texas State University who ended up becoming wrestlers. In Tri-State, he started having issues with Bill Watts. One of the many issues was that Bill Watts was a bit of a bully. And you could tell multiple stories of Bill Watts kind of imposing himself on wrestlers. But Frank Goodish was not only not a small man, he was also not fearful, and he often stood up to Bill Watts, and they had confrontations. But one specific took place where Bill Watts' old school mentality, where baby faces and heels should not travel together. Uh, Brody had gotten stranded in a small town in the territory. He asked Bill Watts for a ride. Because they were mixed as far as baby faces and heels, Watts said absolutely not. We would kill the town if somebody were to see us traveling together. Bruiser Brody and many others said, like, this is a small town. You couldn't draw flies to shit in this town. I can't believe you wouldn't give one of the boys a ride. So that kind of it planted in Bruiser Brody one of the seeds of fuck promoters. So he kind of got this issue that Bill Watts didn't care about the boys and that nobody really cared about making sure that he was going to be taken care of while he was out on the road in tri-state. Another Bruiser Brody recurring issue was him being a bully. So in tri-state, he ran into Danny Hodge. Now, Danny Hodge is a bad motherfucker, an Olympic level wrestler, but he's small. And even though Bruiser Brody is a rookie, he believes that nobody would really believe Danny Hodge could beat me up. And Danny Hodge is a bad dude. And Bruiser Brody is like, nobody's going to believe this guy can beat me up. Danny Hodge has scored an Olympic silver medal in the, I think, Summer Olympics of 1956. So, and he was a superstar in the state of Oklahoma, which is one of the many seats of the tri-state wrestling territory. And Bill Watts is also from Oklahoma. So you have this issue where this rookie, Frank Goodish, shows up and is like, this junior heavyweight champion from the NWA, he can't beat me up. Nobody would believe it, without understanding that the person he's talking to is an Olympic silver medalist and can snap him in half. Of course, Danny Hodge is used to this sort of thing. So he kind of deals with it in a very nice way by kind of grabbing a hold during a match and sort of teaching young Bruiser Brody how to respect the older generation. There was also some issues, I believe, with Watts wanting to break up the tag team with him and Stan Hansen. But, that just caused Frank to leave. So Frank goes to New York, the WWWF, the World Wide Wrestling Federation, where he wrestles for Vince McMahon Sr. This is where he changed his name to Bruiser Frank Brody. Apparently, the name change came from Vince Sr., who didn't think Goodish was a good enough name and didn't really fit him and fit the persona that he wanted to promote for Bruiser Brody. So they called him Bruiser Frank Brody. And this is actually where the story of his homicide actually begins, because he's new to the territory. He's being built up to face Bruno. That's the reason he's being brought in. And he starts wrestling some undercard guy named Jose Gonzalez. And Jose Gonzalez is under the belief that he's being brought to New York in order to be built up to become, one of the Latin stars in New York. This is false. Bruiser Brody refuses to work 50-50 with this guy, Jose Gonzalez, and completely just destroys him. Jose Gonzalez is a smaller Puerto Rican guy. And Brody is supposed to go over, but Jose Gonzalez wants, a little bit more, a little something to make him not look so bad. Brody refuses to sell for him, beats the shit out of him, pins him, really embarrasses him, makes him look bad. And this is kind of the initial seed of the heat between Bruiser Brody and Jose Gonzalez, which will be, of course, paid off in Bayamon, Puerto Rico, with a knife. In any event, Bruiser Brody ended up working against Bruno. They drew 19,418 fans on October the 4th, 1976. And he was a pretty good success. He came after Stan Hansen, though. And Stan Hansen had drew more because they did the storyline where Stan Hansen had legitimately broke Bruno's neck. So he wasn't as big a draw as Stan Hansen. But that was only because Stan Hansen had legitimately broken Bruno's neck and they used it in the storyline. And then Frank had to come in after that. So Frank ended up having some issues with Gorilla Monsoon. Gorilla Monsoon is another big guy. And Gorilla Monsoon, I think it was actually part owner of the WWF at this time. I'm not sure. I have to look at my notes. But Frank started claiming that the WWF, they were liars and he didn't really want to work with them anymore. So he left there too. During this time, he's still pretty new to the business. Again, he debuted in 1974. This is 1976. He's now had a run with Bruno. So he's made a lot of money in the business already. He's fairly young and fairly green. He starts picking up a lot of bad habits from other wrestlers, people who are more successful but maybe a little bit older. So from Maniac Mark Lewin, he kind of learned how to kill a town. So him and Maniac Mark Lewin were working in San Antonio, where they felt like they were getting screwed on paychecks. So the two of them worked the main event match where essentially they sat in a headlock for 28 minutes. And the people started to leave the match. They started to just walk away. They started to just say, okay, we're done. They're not doing anything. So they end up killing the town. They end up really doing damage to the town over a pay dispute. And once he realized the kind of power that he had, it kind of went to his head. So he learned from Buck Robley, who was a friend from Oklahoma. He had met him in Tri-State, that he should avoid territories that are already doing okay, and that you should convince promoters to build around you. Therefore, your value would increase. So always go to struggling promotions and build them up so that you'll make more money in the long term. And with this in mind, he moves to St. Louis in 1978, where he debuts for wrestling at the Chase. In St. Louis, Bruiser Brody started wrestling under the name King Kong Brody. Mainly, he was forced to change his name because Dick the Bruiser was already a big star in St. Louis, and you can't have two Bruisers. So he started calling him King Kong Brody. Now, he got the name King Kong from promotional materials that he had used in the WWF, where Vince McMahon had portrayed him as being almost King Kong on a skyscraper. So that's where the idea came from. So Frank Goodis liked Sam Mushnick, who was, the longtime NWA stalwart. And he particularly didn't like the Kansas City promoters. The Kansas City promoters were Bob Geigel, Pat O'Connor, and Harley Race. And they were starting to gain an influence in St. Louis around this time. And, things started getting a little awkward. Of course, these things will become a really big deal in 5 or so years later. Around this time, Frank's problems continue. He's got into some trouble for beating up an undercard guy named Ed Schaffer, who had ripped off and was mocking his barking gimmick. One of Bruiser Brody's things where he would, bark as he comes to the ring. This would be something, if you ever have seen the Berserker, he go huss, huss, huss. That was an homage in some way to Bruiser Brody. And he would do that on his way to the ring, while in Japan he would swing chains and stuff like that. So Ed Schaffer was doing that, kind of mocking his gimmick, and Bruiser Brody beat the shit out of him for mocking his gimmick. And Sam Mushnick didn't really do anything about it. He just kind of let it happen. And that just kind of let Frank know, like, hey, I can do whatever I want here. So he gets into a pay dispute with Dick the Bruiser, who was one of the promoters in St. Louis, and Frank smacked him, And this was a very wild story, because Dick the Bruiser was known as being a very, very tough guy. But at this point, he's an older man, so he's not quite in his prime. So Bruiser Brody's being seen as a bit of a bully. And he's a guy who, if he can get away with something, he's gonna do it. And so Dick the Bruiser didn't want to pay him, or he felt like he was being shorted, and he just decided he was going to assault the guy. So they tell this great story of how, after he hit him, Dick the Bruiser brought the check of the rest of the money that he was owed, but he did so by handing it to him with his fingers in 2 fingers and pointing at him like a gun, but the paper was between his fingers. So when Bruiser Brody took the money, it was like a gun pointed at him. So the threat was implicit, if you ever do something like that again, you're going to get shot, right? So Bruiser Brody is starting to gain a bit of a reputation as being a bully and somebody who, if he's bigger or younger or stronger than you, he will impose his will physically upon you. So this is, something that's beginning to really bubble throughout the wrestling business. At this point, Sam Mushnick's wife dies while he's still in St. Louis. and he decides he wants out. So Sam Muchnick retires, and he sells the shares of the St. Louis Wrestling Club to Bob Geigel and Pat O'Connor and Harley Race, and I believe Vern Gagne was also involved with this. Frank and Larry Matysik are not fans of this new wave of Kansas City wrestling that has now taken over St. Louis, and the pay diminished. They tell a story in here. Let's skip ahead a little bit to 1983, where Bruiser Brody wrestled Ric Flair, and it was a fantastic match. It's on YouTube if you wanted to watch it. It's the 1983. I think it's the 1 hour match between Bruiser Brody and Ric Flair. They drew $100,000 for this show. Now, in Sam Muchnick's day, he paid 8% to talent. So if you drew $100,000, you make 8% of that. Bob Geigel, quote, adjusted this down to 6%. So he says that no wrestler is ever worth more than $6,000. So they only got paid about $5,000 a piece out of $100,000, and they felt absolutely screwed. And Frank is like, okay, look, the pay is diminishing, the finishes aren't as good, so he starts to no-show the events. He starts to say, well, fuck these guys. I'm not gonna show up. I'm not gonna go. So Larry Matysik, the author of the book, is now, he was an assistant to Sam Muchnick, and he also is not a fan of what the new St. Louis Wrestling Club is all about. So he decides to leave and break out on his own. And Bruiser Brody had promised him, hey, if you decide to go your own way, I'll help you. So he goes to work for Larry Matysik, who is now running opposition to the NWA. Because Bob Geigel, I believe at this time, is the NWA president. And he now runs two different promotions. He runs Kansas City, he runs St. Louis. So Larry Matysik is on his own, running Outlaw with Bruiser Brody. He needs some help. He asked Fritz Von Erich to help him. And he also asked Vince McMahon, who he says he didn't ask him. But I have a hard time believing Vince just volunteered, but it could also be true. So Larry Matysik finds a financier, a man named Charlie Mancuso, who is the manager for the Checker Dome. The Checker Dome is, a very important building in St. Louis at the time. The original deal was 50-50. They would split the profits of these shows 50-50. But after Mancuso lost a great deal of money on the early shows, he changed the deal to 80-20 in favor of himself. So he refused to do business unless he would get 80% of the gate. And Matysik said, okay, this is absolutely not going to work. They decided to go separate ways. Matysik now has to find a new financier. And that's not easy, to find somebody who has the money in order to back you. And as this is happening, Vince McMahon decides he's just going to take St. Louis. He decides, screw Matysik, we're gonna take over. Larry Matysik then calls Fritz Von Erich and says, look, Vince is going to take over, and we need to protect St. Louis from this. How about we merge promotions? I will merge my small independent promotion with World Class Championship Wrestling and give you a foothold in St. Louis. But Fritz not only does not believe Vince is going to take over, he also thinks that Larry Matysik can win a head-to-head promotion with Vince McMahon. And at this point, while they're doing that, Vince is talking to the TV executives. For instance, Ted Koppler of KPLR in St. Louis is a TV station. And he's impressing these TV executives with his roster, with the ratings for his show. And he kind of convinces Koppler to cancel the St. Louis Wrestling Club in 1983. So this is Bob Geigel's group. And now they don't know that they're about to get kicked off TV. Vince has already made the decision. He's already talked to Ted Koppler. They've already made the decision. The St. Louis Wrestling Club is going to get kicked off. The WWF is going to take that spot. So on October 23rd, 1983, Vince McMahon and Ted Koppler made a deal to bring the WWF TV to St. Louis. And by that point, Geigel's group is done. And Larry Matysik is already done too because he can't compete with Vince. Larry Matysik then goes to work for Vince McMahon. I believe he wrote in the WWF magazines. I think that's what his job was for a little while. So what was Bruiser Brody doing as St. Louis was doing its thing? Well, he has started going to Japan. So Sort of the next leg of this is how Bruiser Brody and he kind of gained his reputation in Japan. Bruiser Brody didn't start in Japan in the 1980s, however. He started in 1979 by starting making trips to All Japan Pro Wrestling, which was owned by Giant Baba. He was making $10,000 a week and working there 16 to 22 weeks a year. By 1984, he was making $12,000 a week. So he was making big bank over in Japan. In 1981, he had a long-running tag team with Jimmy Snuka. In 1982, he had a great run with Stan Hansen. His Japanese success led him to become fiercely protective of the Bruiser Brody character in the United States, which made him very difficult to do business with. So this actually, his ego kind of started getting a little over the top. But now he can't go back to St. Louis because St. Louis is dead. Vince has taken over. In 1985, he made the jump to New Japan Pro Wrestling, betraying Giant Baba in All Japan. New Japan, for those of you who are kind of confused, New Japan, Inoki, Baba, All Japan. So he was making $16,000 a week for New Japan. And the reason he jumped ship is he saw that All Japan was now starting to bring in younger guys who were just as big as he was. So, for instance, the Larry Matysik used the example of the Road Warriors. They were starting to come over to Japan, and they were younger, fresher, newer than Brody. Brody had been there off and on for 6 years at this point, and the Road Warriors are fairly new. So he's like, okay, well, you want to bring in these new guys. I'm just going to go and seek my fortune elsewhere. So he goes to New Japan. But he almost immediately started having problems with Inoki. The travel situations are not the same. He feels like Inoki doesn't really take care of the boys in terms of hotel accommodations, travel accommodations, or the creative ideas that, he really wants to impose. So Inoki and Brody are not getting along. So the same year he signed the contract to jump ship, Bruiser Brody talks to Jimmy Snuka and he says, how about we just no-show the rest of this tournament? There's a tag team tournament going on in New Japan. Jimmy Snuka and Bruiser Brody decided they're not going to go. They're not going to finish the tour, rather. So because wrestlers are paid at the end of the tour, they quit before the tour was over. Inoki refused to pay them. So that becomes a huge ordeal where Inoki's like, look, you didn't finish the job. You get paid at the end of the tour. You didn't finish the tour. I'm not paying you. And Bruiser Brody's like, look, fuck you, pay us now. And he's like, nope. So they leave, and they didn't talk to each other for 8 months. In October of 1986, Inoki runs into Bruiser Brody in Hawaii. They have another argument. During this situation, however, Inoki agrees to pay Brody and Snuka the money that he owed them, but they refuse to still go work for him. So they still didn't finish the contract. They got paid, still didn't finish the contract. At this point, All Japan is now starting to get into some issues with Jim Crockett Promotions. So Jim Crockett Promotions is now one of the biggest companies in the United States. They require their world champion, Ric Flair, to be there more than usual. So they pull Flair from his All Japan commitments. And All Japan is like, okay, look, they were uninterested in bringing Bruiser Brody back due to his disloyalty before. And they were like, look, we don't want to do business with that guy. But now that Flair's gone, they need somebody to come in and draw these houses. So they're like, okay, look, we'll do business with Bruiser Brody on certain wavelengths. For starters, he's not being paid as much, and they're not protecting him as they used to. So he's being taught by the Japanese how to be more loyal and how to, he's being humbled in Japan at this point. And as the Japan thing is not quite working out, this is what takes us to Puerto Rico. Bruiser Brody had been back and forth to Puerto Rico, and Puerto Rico was a hotbed of wrestling during the 70s and 80s. At this point, 1988 is where we need to focus on, because this is where he runs into Jose Gonzalez. Jose Gonzalez is now the booker. He's wrestling as Invader number 1 for World Wrestling Council, which is owned by Carlos Colon and Victor Jovica. Carlos Colon, if the name is familiar to you, that is Carlito's father. So Carlos Colon has the booker, which is Jose Gonzalez, and Jose Gonzalez remembers all the troubles he had with Bruiser Brody in New York, and now he's got fresh troubles with Bruiser Brody in Puerto Rico. Despite his political power, Bruiser Brody is continuously disrespecting him, intimidating him in front of the boys, changing the finishes to the matches, essentially doing whatever he wanted. And while it is known that Jose Gonzalez, or at least believed by some of the people who did interviews with his book, that Jose Gonzalez wasn't particularly good when it comes to his creative, nor was he any good at managing egos. He was used to just being able to play the political "I'm the booker" card, but he couldn't really play that card with Bruiser Brody. So Victor Quinones, who was he's sort of the middleman between management and the boys, he's, trying to tell Jose Gonzalez, look, Bruiser Brody is an ego guy, but he's a fair man. If you go and talk to him and, negotiate, these things can be made, you can make things a little bit easier on yourself. But, Jose Gonzalez and almost everything with the Puerto Ricans is a lot about machismo, being tough. And there's a belief that Bruiser Brody is just too much. He's not, you can't reason with him. So apparently there was some type of issues. And in July 16th, 1988, in a bathroom, or in a shower technically, Jose Gonzalez stabbed Bruiser Brody in the stomach with a knife. This was seen by very few people, despite the fact that the locker room had a lot of people in it. Very few people was even paying attention until Bruiser Brody came out of the shower bleeding. There's famous shoot interviews from Tony Atlas and Dutch Mantell and Abdullah Butcher and all these other people who were in town when this happened. Some of them had been wrestling on the circuit the entire time. And Bruiser Brody was rushed to the hospital where he passed away. Apparently, Bruiser Brody had been taking aspirin. He had a headache or, just a painkiller for injuries or things like that. And what it did is it thinned his blood. So because he was taking a painkiller that thinned his blood, he bled more than usual. And this actually led him to die. And after Bruiser Brody died, the promotion, the Colon and Jovica, decided they were going to protect Jose Gonzalez, who was not only the booker, but one of their top guys. And they started sort of, I guess you could say, intimidating witnesses. A lot of the people who were there started kind of being, keep quiet. They also lied to a degree about certain other things. And then they started using sort of political power. The first thing they did was they got the first-degree murder charge dropped down to involuntary manslaughter. And then the court started sort of changing the trial dates. So some of the witnesses were not aware when they were going to be testifying or whether they were supposed to be testifying or not. So mainland United States wrestlers. So Puerto Rico is technically a part of the U.S. That's why I say mainland. So mainland United States wrestlers were kept from participating in the trial by constant dates and things like that being moved around. I'm sure some of them just said that and just didn't want anything to do with this, because Barbara Goodish says later that she was told personally by a lot of guys that because of what happened with Bruiser Brody, they would never work Puerto Rico again. And they continued to do so because the money was too good and a lot of the wrestling was dead, and some of the, WWF is starting to take over by this point. It's 1988. So if they can't get in with Vince, they're just kind of like, look, where am I supposed to work? Jim Crockett Promotions, Japan, Puerto Rico. That's the only thing that I can do. So they're not going to take, food off their own table, which, people kind of forgave them for that. In 1989, the trial ends. Jose Gonzalez's defense was that Bruiser Brody had a reputation for being a big, aggressive bully. And they kind of used all of the stories that had been out there for years. Like, when he smacked Dick the Bruiser, when he did other things to other people. And he used that as his defense, and the people believed it. They believed that Bruiser Brody was a big, violent man, and Jose Gonzalez is a smaller guy. And add to the fact that Jose Gonzalez is also kind of a national hero because he is a top star in the top wrestling promotion in Puerto Rico. And they found him not guilty by reason of self-defense. So this is why Jose Gonzalez was never held accountable for what happened with Bruiser Brody. So even though Bruiser Brody's murder is the most important, usually the one thing that they talked a lot about when it comes to him is that he was killed. You can see that he had a tremendous amount of respect, a tremendous amount of influence in the business. He was like one of the first real, they called him the last outlaw. He was a true independent contractor. He was never going to stay anywhere for too long. He was never going to do anything he didn't want to do. And he didn't have a problem putting his foot down when he felt like he didn't want to do something. It was historic, the things that he was doing to these promoters as far as, changing their finishes. And if they got in his face, who knows what could happen to them. And that reputation in the end is how Jose Gonzalez ended up getting off. So it's a really sad story because a man was murdered, and Barbara Goodish tells the story that she had miscarried a child just before he went to Puerto Rico. She was supposed to go with him to Puerto Rico, but she had miscarried a baby and decided to stay home. And the next thing she knows, he had been stabbed in Puerto Rico. And in the documentary, she tells a deeper story of when, who called her. I think it was either Dutchman, Taylor Abdullah the Butcher had called her and told her that Frank had been, she needed to get to Puerto Rico, but they didn't tell her why. And when she got there, she ran into Abdullah the Butcher, who was, running towards the airport. He's trying to get the fuck out of town. And he was the one who told her that Frank was in the hospital. He still didn't tell her what happened. And she ended up not really knowing that he was dead or that he was had been stabbed until she had really kind of settled in the country, I guess you could say. And it was really sad. It was a really sad story of how she found out and how the boys kind of kept it away from her because they didn't want her to flip out until she got there. And she also, I believe, didn't have anything to do with the trial because she was never contacted, I don't believe. So it's a really sad story. Larry Matysik also kind of plays a little bit of a what if in the book, where he acts like, a lot of people have said throughout the years, why didn't Bruiser Brody just go to the WWF? I mean, Vince McMahon had already taken over St. Louis. Bruiser Brody was a big star in St. Louis. Seems natural that he would have just, been picked up, if for nothing else, but to draw in St. Louis, similar to how the Junkyard Dog was picked up for New Orleans. And how Andre the Giant obviously was brought in because he was big in the New York area, and Bruno and all those guys. Bob Backlund was another one that he kind of inherited those top stars, and he was going around picking up guys of his own. It seemed natural that Bruiser Brody would be one of the guys he would pick up. And Larry Matysik said that he believes Frank could have made a lot of money in WWF, but his style was brawling. His style was brutal. His style was stiff, and Hogan would not have dealt with that. So he felt like it wouldn't have lasted very long. And if he didn't really like working for Vince Sr., then he would have had hell working with Vince Jr. And that would have been a big issue that he felt like they wouldn't have gotten along in terms of personality. Even though Bruiser Brody kind of didn't mind Vince McMahon working in St. Louis when they were there, he just felt like working directly for the WWF wouldn't have been a good thing for Bruiser Brody. You also take into account that Bruiser Brody, when he was killed, was 42 years old, which means he was 39 or 38 or something like that. Well, he was in his late 30s, let's put it like that, when Vince McMahon took over the St. Louis territory. So he probably wouldn't have gotten a long run anyway. Bruiser Brody's story is a story of a guy who was very headstrong, a big draw everywhere he went, who had good psychology, understood the business, but was jaded and bitter. And he had seen promoters constantly fucking over the boys on pay, constantly fucking over the boys in creative, constantly screwing the boys over. He had even accused New Japan and All Japan of conspiring to lower wrestler pay. That was one of the things that he kind of was having a big deal with, which is why he wasn't in Japan, because he had sort of accused them in public of working together to keep wrestler pay down. So he had burned bridges everywhere that he went because he didn't give a shit about promoters. And that kind of cornered him in, Puerto Rico, where it was the only place where he could really work. And then he was burning that bridge there by constantly, not respecting the bookers and the owners and stuff like that. So it kind of it was like a perfect storm where you had this guy who was excellent pro wrestler in every conceivable way, smarter than the average bear in terms of the boys. But because he was so smart, he was bitter. And because he was bitter, that led him to mistreat people. And that mistreatment is what led to him getting stabbed. And ultimately led to him him dying. So this was an incredible story, very sad. But you can see how all the pieces are put together when you sit back and read it, And I know some people, when they do stories on Bruiser Brody, they don't like to, quote unquote, blame the victim. But there's two sides to every tale. And that's why I told this story the way that I did, by telling it from the beginning. Because if you tell the people from the beginning, oh, Bruiser Brody was murdered, and it's a real sad story, a father got killed, his son is now fatherless, his wife is now husbandless. And yeah, you're priming people to feel bad for him. But if you tell the story straight up, as Bruiser Brody has fucked over promoters, abused the boys, abused promoters, then you see why Jose Gonzalez stabbed him. Because it's like, either stab him or fight him. And you're not going to fight the guy because he's huge. So what are you going to do? And if you're a small Puerto Rican guy, the knife is probably going to be the best way to handle that situation. And do I believe that it was self-defense? I don't know. I haven't investigated the case. But I can see why that defense worked. If that's probably the best way I can put it, is that because Bruiser Brody had a reputation and he was sort of proud of it and traded on it, where people knew that when you were doing business with Bruiser Brody, you had to be correct. And in those days, there were no contracts. So when Bob Geigel did his thing and changed the rate of what wrestlers got paid, there was no legal recourse. He couldn't go to the courts and say, this is what I was going to get paid. It was just a handshake agreement with him and Mushnick that he would make 8%. Bob Geigel was like, that ain't got nothing to do with me, 6%. So his option was to leave, which is, the free market option is to take off. But, contracts probably would have helped that a lot. But this was pre-contract days. So this is a very, very interesting story. You learn a lot about how wrestling was back in the day. So you don't just learn about Bruiser Brody, but you also learn about how wrestling was, the kind of characters that ran around there, and what the mentality of the boys were. Because a lot of the mentality of the boys was us versus them. Fuck the promoters. We're going to do us because we're in business for ourselves. And that's really the concept of the independent contractor that, Vince kind of massaged. Let's put it like that, when he kind of stomped out the union talk and all that kind of stuff. Is because, the boys had a habit of fucking over the promoters just as much as the promoters had a habit of fucking over the boys. So it was a cutthroat business in both respects. And if you were a big star like Bruiser Brody was, you could get over with fucking over promoters, because it was just a warning. I fucked him over. Are you going to play fair? And then the promoter would be like, yeah, sure, I'll pay you whatever you want, and pay you on time and regularly and, no problems. But then you had those promoters who were assholes. So they had to learn the hard way. So this is a very interesting book to learn all that stuff from. But let me know what you guys think in the comment section below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe to the channel, donate to the channel. Thank you guys for your time, and I will talk to you guys later.